Welcome to High Noon, where we talk about controversial subjects with interesting people. Delano Squires is a research fellow in Heritage Foundation's Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Life, Religion, and Family, where he writes a lot about the nuclear family and the benefits of fatherhood, among other subjects. So welcome to High Noon. I wanted to have you on here for a while. We've done some NatCon squad stuff together. We've been at various conferences together, but I've always meant to get you on because you bring such an interesting perspective, I think, to this question of family formation and of specifically the role of fatherhood, which I think you talk about really eloquently in a way that really compels people to listen to you. But I guess let's start there then. I mean, I guess this makes sense. So you're a father, I believe, of four. Your kids are homeschooled. Like, how did you? I heard on I think when we were chatting at one of these conferences, you said you grew up in New York. I think you went to public school in New York. So, like, how did you end up being sort of a conservative Christian father of four homeschooler?
That's a great question. First of all, thank you for having me on. I've always enjoyed our conversations at conferences and NatCon, so really looking forward to this conversation. The Christian part sort of carried forward from my upbringing, with my parents and growing up in church. Didn't always act according to what I was taught, but oftentimes a man's deeds and creeds do not align, and sometimes it takes a little while for those two things to come into sort of harmony. But yeah, I grew up in New York City, parent to parents who immigrated to this country. My mom came in late '70s, and my dad came after they got married. And so I grew up in a fairly tight knit community, in an environment that really sort of typifies that adage that it takes a village to raise a child. So I understand that on a very personal level. But that village didn't involve any bureaucrats or elected officials. That village was extended family, neighbors, church family, so on and so forth. And as you said, went to public schools in New York for all but 2 years. I actually went to five schools over the course of my, education, K through 12 education, two elementary, two middle, and one high school. And went off to college, did that, was majoring in computer engineering, which a lot of people don't know, which is one of the reasons I write the way I do. And sort of struggled to find full-time employment after I left college. Ended up back in New York doing some temp work, and then landed here in DC, initially as a leasing consultant. So I was renting people apartments, and then ended up working for local government for almost 15 years. So during that time, I had views, social, cultural, political views that were fairly consistent with where I am now. But I didn't have a worldview. I didn't have a unifying worldview that held it all together. And the way I would explain it to people is that before, and again, I'm someone who grew up in church, before I thought that I owned my own house, right? House being a metaphor for my life. So I owned my house. It was built on a moral foundation that I created. So whatever I thought was right and wrong. And in that house was a number of rooms. So finances, relationships, politics, race, culture, and religion was one room in that house. And every Sunday, I would let Jesus out of that room so he could have the full run of the place for between 10 and 11:30. And by 1 p.m., he had to go back in his room, and then I continued to be sort of the master of my domain. But over the course of years and just growing spiritually, being under better teaching, and just coming to certain realizations, I I decided to tear down that house because that foundation was not secure at all, and I realized that now in retrospect. Um, and I decided, or I allowed the reconstruction to be built on a biblical foundation where God owns the entire house, all of the rooms, and sort of the fragrance that emanates from the scriptures can be caught in any part of the house. So it's not just a Sunday thing, right? I'm not the type of person that says, ask me a question and I say, Inez, I'll give you one answer on Sunday and I give you a completely different answer on Tuesday afternoon. So I've tried to have, what I believe and the things that I say and how I live my life come into greater alignment. So with that, my views on education, right? As you mentioned, we homeschool, stem from the Bible, and particularly the command that fathers are to bring up their children in the fear and admonition of the Lord. So it's like education is, when I think of education as a parent's rights issue, that's not just rhetoric. I really believe that, and that's why my wife and I decided that we did not want a 24-year-old pink and blue hair Teach for America graduate who has no children of her own, owns no property, has no investment in our children, to be shaping the morals and values of our kids 10 hours a day for the next 12 years, so that by the time they go off to university, after one semester, they come back hating everything that we taught them. So all of the things that I say about family, about marriage, about fatherhood, about education, about crime and punishment, about life, about sex and sexuality, gender identity, and all of those things sort of spring from the worldview, the new worldview, that I'm trying to keep my house built on.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is uh, something that is often lost, even sort of on the center right, is something that you're implying with what you're saying about education, which is that there is a moral instruction component to education. There isn't really a way of separating out a sort of moral worldview or an
Mm-hmm.
ethical instruction from academics fully. I know when we grew up, I think we're both 90s babies, right? Like, I think people imagined that that was possible, but there was still, at least there was still very much a background worldview. It just wasn't as overtly
Right.
political. Now it's much more overtly political and obvious, I think, to people. But because I often get pushback sometimes from people, even on the right or in the center, who say, "Well, I just want my kid to learn the 3 R's."
Mm-hmm.
Like, what would you say to that pushback? I just want them to learn how to read, write, and do math, learn a little history. I'll take care of their moral foundation or their moral formation at home.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I mean, when I went to school, so let's just even say high school, I don't remember having teachers that were pressing their political opinions on me. That wasn't part of the curriculum, and the way I sort of articulate what it is that you said is that education is equal parts scholarship and discipleship, right? So it's academic mastery and moral formation. So that I hold those two things to be equal parts of the education experience. So I understand parents that say, to your point, I want them to learn the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. That's probably how my parents were. And I think for the most part, that's what parents got when they sent their kids to school, certainly in the 90s and even into the early 2000s. Um, I'm not sure we can return to that point, because to me, the genie's out of the bottle. And now what it is, it's a battle in the public square, which is both at the state house and in the schoolhouse. So, I, I mean, maybe getting back to the 3 R's is sort of that neutral sort of point of faux neutrality. I don't get the sense the left wants to go back there. And I think part of what the right is doing is saying, look, if the schoolhouse is going to be more explicitly involved in moral instruction, right, for a number of reasons, then we prefer that instruction to look like the success sequence, where kids are learning, even in a descriptive manner, that if you finish high school, get a job, marry, and then have kids, your chance of being in poverty by your mid 30s is in the single digits. The right may say, look, if we're going to be in the moral formation business, let's teach that instead of teaching kids that men can have babies and it's possible for a man to lactate and breastfeed, right? those are two sort of opposite ends of the spectrum. And maybe somewhere in the middle is getting back to that 3 R's, but something tells me we've sort of blown past that point.
Yeah, that's very much what Ian Rowe, and the schools that he ran, and then now the new schools that he's running,
Hmm.
are teaching, which is the success sequence, the cardinal virtues. It's kind of a, but it is a strong. It's a secular worldview because it's a charter school, but
Hmm.
it's a strong, strong moral shaping worldview, right?
Hmm.
I've never bought into this idea that you can have this instruction totally divorced from moral foundation or formation because it's also just not interesting, right? In many cases, the most interesting thing to learn is about human beings and who we
Hmm.
are, why, what our rationalizations and motivations are, what we are. Are we, just flesh and blood and bones? Are we? Is there some kind of spiritual or soul dimension to us? Is the mind the same as the brain? Right? These are the interesting questions. What is human nature? Why do we behave the way that we do? Are we
Mm.
intrinsically good or bad? Like these are interesting questions, and it seems to me that an education divorced from those questions is not actually preparing someone to live life as a human being. It may prepare them to be, to your point, a computer programmer, or to have, now it's college and career readiness, right?
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
it's not really an education in the deep sense, and that it leaves kids alone when they inevitably confront these kinds of questions about, life and death and morality and human nature. Like, and there is an enormous font of wisdom in the past, whether it comes from revelation in terms of a Christian perspective, or whether it comes from the ancient world, or the philosophy that proceeded from that. We have this enormous tradition and heritage in the Western world that I don't want to say answers all of these questions definitively, but it sure helps us to
Hmm.
think about them, and cutting someone off from that heritage, in my view, cannot be called an education, even if they know how to read a technical document. You know what I mean?
Right. Right. No, that's a fantastic point, and actually that point I think speaks as much to pedagogy as it does to sort of moral formation. Right. That's one of the reasons that I'm a fan of, and we actually, my wife, who's the headmistress of our school, our homeschool, um, we use classical conversations as sort of our core curriculum, and it blends. It's a classical Christian curriculum, so you get some of the best of both worlds, and so it does draw on the past and exposes, students to great books, great literature, right, to great thinkers, but also, again, that particular curriculum rests on a explicitly Christian and biblical worldview. And I think what you get now in a lot of sort of educational sectors, especially anything that sort of bills itself as progressive, is a much more inward focused education. So it's, how do I feel? Do I see myself in the curriculum? When I'm reading whatever text, right? Does anyone there talk like me? Do they have my experiences? And while I may understand people who think that way, I think it's a very limiting way to approach education, and all it does is feed the worst impulses of the culture, across the board. And I would say right up at the top of that list in terms of the worst impulses is narcissism. Everything has to be about me, and I have to be at the center of every conversation, and people who look like me have to be, proportionally representative in every area of society. And I don't think that's particularly healthy, because all it does is teach kids to continue to be navel gazers. And I feel like that's what our public education churns out today, and not just K through 12, but in college, and I think that has even sort of flowed upstream into some of the, advanced professions or advanced degrees, and among the so-called elite. So yeah, I agree with you. I think, um, having an education that sort of takes kids outside of themselves and exposes them to different manners of thinking, I think is a really good idea. And again, with that, answering some of those metaphysical questions come, like, what is the nature of right or wrong? But then even that comes back to, how do you define right or wrong, right? Is morality relative? Is it absolute? Where does it come from? If we're just sort of cosmic stardust, this would probably be the Neil deGrasse Tyson, perspective. Why is killing a person wrong? Well, it's not wrong when a lion kills a zebra. So why is it wrong if Jack kills Jim for something that he wants? Those are some of the questions. I don't even think schools are even trying to wrestle with those questions. It'd be nice if they can just, again, before they get to who are we and where do we come from, it would be nice if they could settle on what is a woman. But I feel like we're sort of we're sliding backwards, so we can't move to those greater questions, until we can answer the more, simple questions. So
The obvious ones. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the representation argument, it is narcissistic ultimately. I think it's also very feminine in a certain sense. I think little boys often have no problem putting themselves, like, because they imagine themselves on certain, like, internal things like valor, or they, read Ivanhoe. And
hmm
I don't think, for
hmm
example, little black boys have problems identifying when they read Ivanhoe oftentimes, right? Because
hmm
there just seems to be something about it. Maybe it makes sense, right? Women care more about how they look for good reasons, right? Like, maybe it's just something in the feminine spirit to always want to see yourself, like, because it affirms that, yes, you're beautiful, you're loved, right? Whereas I feel like boys, left to their own devices, I don't think they really tend to think that way. They tend
No,
to, like,
no.
immediately say, "Of course I'm the knight in the story." You know? Of course I could be. Um,
Right.
but, maybe we should turn this conversation, at least, temporarily, to race, because a lot of what you write about, for those who aren't watching on YouTube, right? Um Delano is in fact black, you can see
hmm
on YouTube.
hmm
Um, no, but, you know, Moynihan, Senator Moynihan, I think of New York, right, wrote this report all the way back in the early
hmm
'60s talking about the out of wedlock, birth rate in the Black community, and saying basically, this is a crisis, this is gonna cause a huge problem. Of course, now we look back, and I think it was at 25% or 30%
Correct.
then.
Yeah,
Um
25%.
and, now we look at it, the Black community, I think it's like 79 or 80%, but it's, you guys are
Not
far
that
from
high.
alone, because we're all catching up, right?
Yeah,
If you
yeah,
look at,
yeah.
increasingly, if you look at Hispanic out of wedlock birth rate, at, white out of wedlock birth rate, I think Asians are still very low on this metric, fortunately for them. But, um, overall, America is, I saw a really shocking map, that America has the highest among the world, among the
hmm
highest percentage of children who are not living with both biological parents,
hmm
right? So, one, what in your view has this done since Moynihan wrote that report to your community? And then what are your fears about us all? Because I feel like this is a much more universal question now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I call that sort of 25% mark the Moynihan threshold, right? And in 1965, that was a cause for emergency, right? 1 out of 4 Black children being born to unwed parents was a cause for emergency. And to your point, the only sort of major ethnic group that falls below the Moynihan threshold today, are Asians. They're at about 12%. Whites at about 28%. Overall, as a country, we're at 40%. So 4 out of 10 children in this country are born to parents who are not married. Hispanics at 52%, American Indians at 69%, and the Black community at 70%. So these are not numbers that bode well for anyone, right? These trends are going completely in the wrong direction. Um, I'm concerned a great deal, and particularly, with respect to the Black community, because again, the number is so high. Um, let me say this for a quick second. Oftentimes, what people will do to deflect from social phenomena that are hard for them to deal with honestly is to say, "Oh, well, the majority of insert ethnic group are not doing insert, you know, bad thing, right? Majority of white people aren't doing drugs. The majority of Black people aren't committing crimes." And again, those things will very well be true. But that's not the point. The point is to look at a particular trend and see which way it's going. This is one of the few things where you can actually say, yes, the majority of Black children are born to parents who are not married. So the norm is out of wedlock births in the Black community, and it's not just within low income neighborhoods. Um, I saw data that showed that about 1/3 of Black women who have college degrees have children out of wedlock, and this was back in 2016. So, to the extent that this social phenomenon is real, and it is, this is something that has to be dealt with openly and honestly. Now, many of the women who are in that category today are in a much better position to take care of their children financially than women were, let's say, in 1965, where at that time the median occupation for a Black woman, particularly in the South, was domestic. That is not the case anymore. You have women who have degrees in cybersecurity and nurses and teachers who are able to financially care for a child in a way that was, again, not necessarily the norm a generation ago. But fathers are more than just paychecks. And I believe that if it takes two to make, it takes two to raise, and that children need a father in the same way that children need a mother. And to the extent that the role of fathers has been exclusively about provision and protection, I think we've sort of done ourselves a disservice. Obviously, I'd say that that's a baseline. And going back to my upbringing, I remember my Sunday school teacher. Me and my three best friends, sort of known within our family, set as the four horsemen. And he was teaching from a biblical text, and he said, "Any man that doesn't take care of his household is worse than an infidel." And that was seared into my mind as a child. So I'm all for baseline. As a man, you are responsible for the children that you create. But as a father now, I know I bring a lot more to the table than just what I'm able to provide financially. And kids desire presence, ENCE, a lot more than presence, ENTS. And there's a certain sense of security that fathers bring. Children tend to interact differently, with their dads. Dads are much more likely to roughhouse with kids, particularly with boys. There's certain things that dads do in terms of, their tendency towards gross motor skill development, and as opposed to moms, generally speaking, are more on the fine motor skill development. So there are all types of things that fathers bring to the table. But one of the most important ones is the understanding, particularly as kids get older, that even if their dad is not around, they have a father. And his absence creates questions in their mind. Now, it's one thing for you to say, well, son, your dad served honorably in the military and he was killed in battle. Kids at a certain age can sort of grapple with that. Obviously, there's going to be loss, but they understand that. There's another thing to say, well, your dad is around, he just doesn't want anything to do with you. And whether you say that or not, kids eventually will sort of get the picture. And to paint how clearly this is not just an issue of race, one of the stories that's out now is that the president of the United States, who has a drug addicted son, also has a granddaughter that he will not allow his staff to acknowledge. So neither Hunter Biden nor the president, Joe Biden, will acknowledge the granddaughter that Hunter, or the child that Hunter had. I want to say this woman was a stripper. I believe that's correct. And no matter what she gets in child support or the other side benefits that she gets from people knowing that she's a Biden, I think it is highly unlikely that child will not grow up with some sort of loss, wanting to know why her father and her grandfather do not want her. And especially as she gets older and she sees the political ads where the current president says, "Oh, they're not your children, they're our children. These are America's children. These, right? Your kid, Delano, your kid is my kid." And she's gonna say, "Man, he feels more ownership over the children of strangers than he does over me, and I'm his flesh and blood." Like, that does something to a child. So I think that there are reasons to talk about this particular issue that go beyond, the poverty rate for single mothers. Though important, Dads bring a lot more to the table than just a paycheck.
How do you talk about these issues because of the numbers that you've just listed out, and we haven't even talked
Hmm.
about children of divorce, right?
Right, right.
Um, how do you have these conversations in a place where two things are true? One, basically everyone, either they themselves have experienced this kind of loss in terms of not growing up in a married biological two-parent household, or they have friends or relatives who have not. So one, there's a lot of defensiveness out there, but two, there's I think there's a denial of the loss at all, right? When it becomes a norm, when
Mm,
you're talking about a neighborhood where, 4 out of 5 children, are born without their fathers in the picture, um, at what point does it just become like an almost like you don't know what you're missing because not only
mm,
do not have anything to compare it to in your own life, none of your friends have anything to compare it to. At that point, it's not the individual tragedy of a child without a father. It's truly fatherlessness in an
hmm.
entire community, and nobody even knows that they're missing a limb.
The I I love the way you ended that question because the phrase that came into my mind as you were talking was compensation injury, right? You see this sometimes in sports. A person will hurt, they may be coming back from an Achilles tear. And one of the things that you have to be mindful of is that while trying to compensate for bad Achilles, that you don't end up messing up your ACL, right? Because that's what tends to happen. All of us, most people obviously are not professional athletes, but if you sprain your ankle, you walk with a limp and you walk a little more gingerly. But but that sprain in the ankle can lead to injuries other places. And I think what happens is, yes, it is possible for you to be compensating for so long that your limp becomes normal to you, but other people can tell that you're limping, right? And when you have, to your point, a community where none of the kids are being raised by married biological parents, like that has serious downstream effects. Now, I will say this, and I think this is important to point out, particularly for conservatives. One of the ways that I talk about this, and I understand that this issue of non-marital birth, right, out of wedlock birth rate, is inextricably linked to race for some of the reasons that we talked about, right? Going back to Moynihan, and even particularly if you talk to folks on particularly progressives and Black progressives, they will tie this back to the plantations of the South. They'll say that this started in slavery. One, I think it's important to point out that in the early 20th century, like up until I want to say like 1950, Black men and women were more likely to be married by 35 than their white counterparts. So the notion that the Black family disintegrated in slavery does not line up with the facts. And in fact, one of the first things that newly emancipated slaves did was look to piece their families back together. And I mean, they're newspapers, and there's a project that I want to say is partnering with Villanova University to digitize a lot of these ads and papers. And it would be something to the effect of, I'm Jack Johnson, my wife MMA was sold from the Liscum plantation in Louisiana to a different plantation in Texas. And I'm looking for her and our 4 children. And if you see her or find her, tell her to find me here, care of Pastor, Manning in Louisiana. Like there's hundreds, if not thousands, of ads like that that were taken out by free Blacks after emancipation. So this is not this is much more, the proximate cause, particularly in the Black community, is much more tied to the 1960s than it is the 1860s. That being said, I think for conservatives, one of the things that's important is to be precise in our language. And this is a principle that I hold to. The more dangerous the weapon, the more care you have to take in wielding it. So I'll put it this way: when I'm playing with my kids with a super soaker, I'm much freer than if I was handling a live weapon, right? And I say that because sometimes what conservatives will do, they'll take 70% out of wedlock birth rate and say 70% of kids in the Black community are fatherless. And that's not true. And it's not just, I know it's not true, not just because of the data, because a significant number of Black children are being raised by parents who are cohabiting, because that is one thing that is present today across ethnic groups that was not present in the 1960s. So if you were being raised by a single parent, an unmarried parent in the 1960s, it was 88% moms and 12% dads. I want to say it's like 30% of couples now are cohabiting. Unmarried couples with children are cohabiting. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that there are fathers, and I've seen this, just from places I've lived, where, when we lived in DC and I did drop offs at daycare, local, like right in my neighborhood, or at my daughter's public charter school, I'd say at least 30 to 35% of the drop offs and pickups were dads. And these were overwhelmingly Black men, 98%. So it's not to say that these men are not involved in the lives of their children. What I will say is it's a lot easier to be involved in the life of your child when your child is under 5 years old. But the United States is not Europe. So we don't have a culture of long-term monogamous partnership outside of marriage. And the longer you wait and the longer you remain unmarried, the more likely the relationship is to break up. And then that leads to multi-partner fertility. So a guy has 3 kids by 2 women and a woman has 4 kids by 3 men, that type of thing. So I think it's important to be precise with our language. 70% out of wedlock birth rate is different than saying 70% of kids are fatherless. But with that, I think we need to be honest and upfront. We need to let people know that just because we're talking about, family formation, marriage, out of wedlock birth rates, we're not attacking you, your life decisions, your mom, your dad, your family. And we find a way to do this when we're talking about college, because every urban education system has their walls plastered with, flags, Harvard class of, 2036, and, Hampton University class of 2042, that type of thing. And schools do that knowing that they're talking to kids, many of whom come from families where no one has gone to college. So we know how to have conversations talking about ideals in the context of people who have not necessarily lived those out in their lives. So I think a big part of it is just talking about what we think is best for society, what is most likely to lead to human flourishing, to let people know we're not making personal judgments on your specific behavior. And ultimately, we promote the natural family because common sense and decades of data show that that is what is best for children. And you said this the other day on Twitter, and I want to like it 1,000 times, where you said, and I'm paraphrasing, something to the effect of and I've said this as well, the greatest privilege that any child has today is not, their skin color, but it's being raised in a loving, stable, low conflict home with a married mom and dad. And I agree with that with every fiber of my being, and that's across ethnic groups, across religion. I think you were spot on with your assessment.
We'll get to some of the, I think, after effects of men and women essentially splitting, and living most of their lives separately. I mean, in context of when there are so many families, let's say it's a smaller percentage, but some percentage, as you say, if the mom and dad are not married, it's much more likely that the father talks to the children, once a week, once a month, right? It just that's statistically more likely. So, in the context that a lot of kids are not getting, they may not have a relationship with their father, especially if they're a girl and they don't have a relationship with their father. There are probably fewer boys that don't have a relationship with their mother, just by the nature of,
Right.
of childcare, more women end up taking care of the kids when the parents split. Although single fathers do have, like, children raised by single fathers have better outcomes often than those raised by single mothers. I think that's probably selection. In other words, if the dad is dedicated enough and the mother crazy enough, that the children go to the father, oftentimes that's a sort of self-selecting group. But so there are more and more kids who don't have that relationship. We have smaller families, so there are more and more kids who don't have siblings. I was thinking about this a few weeks ago. The number of people who have never had a long-lasting, deep, loving relationship with the opposite sex is probably quite high. And if your first introduction to relationships with the opposite sex is the modern sexual market, I can see how that creates a certain antagonism on both sides. I think on the female side, it is showing up even in political polls where single women are vastly pulling away to the left, not only versus men as a whole, but versus married women. And then in Gen Z, we've seen quite a bit of a diversion in the graph where women, like girls, Gen Z girls, are extremely left wing. And Gen Z boys are starting to be extremely right wing. And so you've written some critiques. So all of that, I think I want to put as the background. So you've written a critique of the online manosphere, right? Basically, talking about sort of this reaction, the like men going their own way, or the kind of game blogs that focus on being able to pick up women, but not adhering to what you said when we started this conversation, right? About the line from the Bible about a man who doesn't provide for his family, right, is worse than an infidel. Definitely not adhering to that line, either foregoing having children or leaving it to women to raise their children. And encouraging that because, feminism and women have, gotten so bad that there isn't, it's a bad prospect for a man to commit himself to a wife and children. So first, why don't you lay out your argument there, and then we can discuss it.
Sure. My argument there is that conservatives should not let what I call the masculine critique, quote unquote, go unchallenged, right? So the masculine critique in many respects is the mirror image of the feminine mystique, right? Many people are familiar with, Betty Friedan's 1960s work on that particular topic. And the core of the masculine critique is that in a world where women have more economic, political, legal, and cultural power than ever before, traditional notions of marriage, family, children are a bad deal for men. So what a lot of these guys will say is, would you encourage someone to go into a business relationship where the other person is incentivized to break the contract? And not only that even if they break it, they still walk away with half of your assets. First, let me say, I understand that critique. And the more I listen to some of these guys, and the more I just observe what's going on in the culture, the more I say, okay, I understand how this person will get there. Now, personally, my wife and I will be married for 11 years coming up, at the end of the month. I've never once looked at the divorce laws in any of the states that we've lived in. I've never looked at, child support, alimony. None. I have no idea what those laws say. But I understand if you're a guy who's gone through a messy divorce, an ugly custody battle, I understand why you would get to the point where you say, look, this is not a good deal for men. And one of the people that I named specifically in a recent piece I did was Jeff Younger, right? He ran for Congress in Texas, again, involved in a very ugly custody battle with his ex-wife. And particularly, she wanted to, quote unquote, transition their son into a girl. And that was a very public thing. He went through, this court case in Texas. So when he says that men who desire a family should avoid marriage and basically procure children through adoption and surrogacy, I think it's important to acknowledge, he's probably speaking from a place of very deep and personal pain. In the same way, many of the feminists who are easy to caricature speak from a similar place of deep and personal pain when it comes to how they saw their mothers treated by their dads. And it made them say, I don't want any part of this thing. And I guess my major contention is if the feminists on the far left say marriage is a bad deal for women, it's oppressive, children keep them tied to the household, and really what women should be doing, particularly in their 20s and 30s, in their prime years, is focusing on their education and their career. And the red pill guys on the right, sort of, are saying marriage and family are a bad deal, right? They sap men of their energy and their resources. And really what men should be doing in their 20s and 30s in their prime years is focusing on their education and career. We are doomed as a society because you can't, the primary function of one generation is to propagate the next. And if those two opposite ends of the spectrum end up bending in towards one another to form a complete circle, and that becomes our norm, we're in big trouble. So, you know, that's why I don't think conservatives should overlook some of these issues, right? There may be ways to address child support laws and divorce laws and so on and so on and so forth. But I always think part of what we should be doing, part of what I try to do, is to paint a more positive and affirming vision of what marriage and family can look like, even in the midst of the cultural changes we've seen over the last 60 years.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm kind of of two minds about this. On the one hand, I mean, I agree with you at the end of the day, right? As I told you off air, if there is no winning the battle of the sex wars, if the sex wars continue, there is no future for the human race, right? So at some point, right, there'll be too much fraternizing with the enemy. This has to come to a close, right? On the other hand, I do find myself in agreement with two major critiques, I think, even leaving aside the specific policy, about which I think there is plenty to be done in terms of family courts and elsewhere. Strengthening marriage. My husband and I actually, it's kind of a useless gesture, but we are what my parents called super married. Well, my mother likes to joke that my husband is my second husband, my second marriage, because a year after we got married in California, we went to Arizona. They're one of 3 states that have so-called covenant marriage, right? So but it's not really legally enforceable, because even if you lived in the state, all one party would have to do is go to another state. I mean, it's not really like legally functional, but you know, it meant something to us that essentially that it's not no fault divorce. You have to show fault to leave. It's not that there are no situations in which it's better for married people to be apart than together, but you have to show one of the traditional bases of fault, which I believe are abandonment, addiction, adultery, and abuse. Yes. So, I mean, there's plenty to be done on the laws, but where I find myself in agreement with some of these like sort of angry manosphere pickup artist type people is that the culture encourages female bad behavior in a way it doesn't encourage men's bad behavior. By which I mean, of course, women are no worse than men. There are sort of feminine virtues and feminine negative qualities, toxic qualities, you might call them, right? There are masculine good qualities and masculine bad qualities. Many of these qualities are the same thing depending on how they're channeled, right? Like just like, you know, aggression in men could be, you know, channeled towards protecting their families and those weaker than them, or it could be into being violent and you know, taking stuff from the weak, right? Those are in some sense the same trait. I think sort of caring about consensus, right, and is a very important trait within a family that women often bring, caring about people's feelings and consensus. But when it goes into the boardroom, it becomes kind of this oppressive PC like HR regime, right? Where everybody has to care about the person who's most easily offended, basically wins the game, right? And everybody else has to cater to them. So many of these things are the same thing, but it strikes me that, there's no political movement and no, cultural sort of mass celebration of men sleeping with their secretaries, right? Of men who leave their wives and families to sleep with their 25-year-old subordinates. Um, there are plenty of depictions of that happening, as indeed it happens in, not infrequently in real life. But
Hmm.
there isn't this sort of cultural sanction. If you as a man, let's say you're a 45-year-old man with a wife and 40-year-old wife who has, 3 kids of yours, and you leave her for a 25-year-old, your friends
Hmm.
aren't going to endorse it. Like, they may continue to
No.
be your friends, but nobody's gonna clap you on the back and say, like, "Go for it, you deserve this," right? Um, there's not gonna be a movie made about you and how you're exploring yourself by leaving your 40-year-old wife and sleeping with a 25-year-old, right? Um, and yet we have all of those things for women, right? We have the eat, pray, love entire thing. We have this, like,
Hmm.
self-care therapeutic idea that, it's actually, it's a positive thing. It's not something in your selfishness is not something that you should fight and, rise above, hopefully, and maybe sometimes you're selfish anyway, but then try not to be. There's none of that. The culture full on lauds female narcissism and selfishness in a way that it doesn't laud male negative traits in the same way. And so in that environment, I can really see why maybe I don't agree obviously that men shouldn't, get married, but I understand why there's this frustration, because what's happened is that the female side of this equation has been handed a whole lot of power with
Hmm.
basically no accountability, and I can see why that there's a huge backlash to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes we share some of the same notes because I've said it in exactly the same way. Right now, I think maybe the closest you can get to sort of the male counterpart, right? The male side of the equation in terms of executive leaving his family for secretaries like Mad Men or something like that. Now I didn't watch Mad Men,
Shows shows
so
it
I'm
shows it
I'm
as a very negative. That's what I always get, by the way, is Mad
okay.
Men, and I think it shows what it does to his life, and what, ultimately he ends up humiliating his daughter, his young daughter, who he loves,
Mm,
with the way that he behaves, and you could like, I don't think that that's showing it. I think that like, good art shows something that's true, right?
right,
That happens, it's a depiction of it, but
but
I
doesn't
guess
always
you could very
glorify
shallowly read that series as like, "Yeah, he's just having a great time, like, sleeping with a series of younger women," but that's completely not any serious reading of the show is not that, I think.
Okay, so I'm glad you clarified. So all I know is, as a sort of an outside observer, is that the show was very popular, right? And I know that this was part of what it was depicting in that culture. I think in the 1960s. But to your point, now you have out and out sort of celebration, right? I'm thinking of, I want to say it was the Atlantic ran a piece a couple of years ago, and it started with a woman saying, I destroyed my marriage and my family. And this was like, again, this was piece was hailed because apparently this person was like a well-known writer. And then you get down to it, and it's just like, okay, she was somewhat unhappy. She didn't want her identity to be tied to herself as a wife and a mom. She wanted to do yoga on Tuesday afternoon and drink Chardonnay on Thursday evening. It's like, okay, so because of that, you destroy your family. And I do think that that is one significant difference. And I think you hit the nail right on the head. I'm thinking of someone like Tia Mowry, who's a child actor, her and her twin sister, who when she announced her divorce on the show, whatever the show's called, it's not The View, but similar type of deal. She said, well, she graduated from her relationship. So it's always the language of personal therapy. It's about living your truth and all this other stuff that again, as an engineer, don't necessarily understand. I don't typically speak in this sort of ephemeral language. But I do think, to your point, the culture rewards female bad behavior as a sign of empowerment. And that's both in terms of standards of whether you're talking about modesty and decorum, or you're talking about family formation or family destruction. And I don't think that that's healthy for culture. And I understand why guys are very hesitant to, enter into a marriage. And I'm like you, I think of marriage as a covenant, as a lifelong relationship where husband and wife become one, not as a contract where someone can get out of it as soon as they don't feel that they're at a level 100 sort of state of happiness. But I do think that that's something that has to be addressed. But it's hard because we live in a culture that says that any boundaries on what women think, say, or do are oppressive. And my wife and I've had this conversation, and I've said people are not against gender roles at all. No one actually believes in equality, because if they did, then even sort of the uber feminist who happens to be married to a man, she would say when something goes bump in the night, honey, you stay there. You got it last time. And because we're a feminist family, I'll get up and check on, what's going on downstairs. So I don't think that even the feminists believe truly in gender equality in that sense. But the way I would frame it is this: I just think the in terms of roles, there's much more elasticity on the side of women than on the side of men, because again, even today, a man has to at least be a protector and a provider. And those roles are rigid and they remain in place. But when you ask someone, okay, so what does a woman have to do? What are the 2 or 3 things that she has to do to be seen as a good wife and a good mother by society? Then everybody starts to backpedal and they start to mumble, and it's not cooking and cleaning because you can pay someone for that. It's not. So I think there's just a lot more. The roles on that side are a lot more elastic, and I think it causes difficulty because elasticity and boundaries don't go together, and norms don't, because norms say you should go this far and no further. But when people want complete elasticity, they want complete freedom, complete range of motion and movement, any type of norm, any type of boundary, even on behavior and conduct, is seen as oppressive. So yeah, I get why guys think that this is a bad deal. I'll give you a perfect example of this, tangible example. I'm not sure if this is sort of crossed your timeline. It certainly has been all over mine. CNN picked up the story, by the way. There's an actress, fairly young, she's in her mid-20s, named Keke Palmer. So she's a Black woman, been in a number of different like Disney type films when she was younger. She has a baby with a guy. I don't think he's an actor. I'm not sure who he is, but so she has a baby with this gentleman. They're not married. Video surfaced this weekend of her out, I want to say in Vegas, at an Usher concert, and Usher was serenading her. And not only that, she twirled around because she just had the baby and showed off her postpartum body, right? And how do I describe the outfit? Basically looked like a one-piece swimsuit with like a sheer black, see-through skirt dress thing attached, right? So you can see a bottom. And the father of her child got on Twitter and said, I don't like this. He said, you're a mom. And he was, as you can guess, roundly criticized and attacked for this. And then he went on to say, I'm paraphrasing, but something to the effect of, we live in a crazy generation when the man of the family basically says he doesn't want the wife and mother of his child to be out there showing her bare cheeks to the entire world. And I mean, he got so much criticism, I think he deleted his account. And when it gets to the point where you can't even say, hey, I don't like the fact that my lady is out there showing, her cheeks to Usher and everybody else on the internet, and you get attacked for that, that just goes to show you where this is a very different culture than what, and very different cultural norms than what we had 60 years ago. And I don't see any appetite to recover more traditional ways of being outside of a few sort of, religious communities or people who have a very, very strong sense of morality, public morality. The general mainstream culture, no one is going to criticize that. And I think it's because of what you said. Like, people, and particularly women, don't want to feel as if they are being overly critical, that they're leaving anyone out. And this is the same impulse that has fueled the transgender movement, right? Where yesterday's feminists, who said my identity is rooted in sort of patriarchal oppression, don't want to be tomorrow's oppressors to so-called transgender people. And because of that, they will allow men to come into their space and set the rules and terms and definitions of womanhood. And they'll do so and saying, look, I'm a caring and inclusive person. This is real feminism. Getting men into women's sports is real feminism. That's the type of thing that they would say. And it's unfortunate and it's ironic because those women have finally found a group of men that they're willing to submit to. Unfortunately, those are men who also think that they're women. So,
yeah, no, the Keke Palmer thing is a good example of the dynamic that I was talking about. It's not that women behave more badly than men. I don't think. I think both sexes are in a competition right now to outdo each other. But women's bad behavior, you've got the entire culture comes in, and it's always like, I'm sure there's some background to that. Like every individual interaction like that has, a completely personal dimension outside of what the public can see. But in terms of the public domain, right, there's so much support for women behaving this way. There is no incentive. Like it's hard to be a good person. It's hard to be a good woman. It's hard to be a good man. And if there's no incentive from the culture to push people in that direction, so that's really where I see the difference. It's not so much in obviously I don't think my sex is worse than yours. I don't think that women behave or are inherently worse. They have less virtue than men. I simply think the environment for them, there's so much incentive to behave badly, and there's nobody saying don't behave this way. In fact, there's encouragement for it. I wanted to ask you one more thing before we start wrapping up here, and that's the other side of this critique, because some of the sort of online, let's call it the Baphosphere or whatever, there's also this. You mentioned the idea that a wife and family sort of sap something from men that you were disagreeing with. Is there not some diversion in history between glory and family for men? In other words, is there not a role for a certain kind of like martial class outside of the norms of family and having that influence? Because I mean, I think on average, especially in a good marriage, like men and women influence each other positively, and you can even see that sort of politically. You can see that women who are married, they come a lot closer to their husband's political opinions oftentimes, and you can see that in the statistics, right? Men, find a different side of themselves when they feel tender towards their children, right? I think this is, for the most part, this is a good thing. But can't you acknowledge that there's a need for society to have a certain percentage of young men who are out there for ambition and glory, unblunted by not just the burdens, but even the like transformation of a family?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I could certainly see that. So, for instance, I could see why having a certain percentage of men who enlist in the military be men who do not have sort of the obligations that come with having a wife and children. I could get that. Right. Even I'm thinking of, James Bond, and particularly the Daniel Craig sort of legacy, where they went into his backstory, and not only was he unmarried and didn't have any kids, I won't go into any spoilers, but I think his backstory, he was also an orphan, right? So men who are unencumbered, quote unquote, unencumbered by family, I do think have a place in society. I just don't think that type of I think that's a momentary, right? That's a time bound sort of position to be in. I don't think having a society where the average man remains a bachelor until he dies is a good thing. And part of what some of the red pill guys will say is, men in their 20s, and particularly one person says, if you want to be a high value man in your 20s, one, he says, get a vasectomy. Now, I'm not going to go into all the reasons why I think that's a bad idea, but he says, get a vasectomy, get off of drugs and alcohol. Okay, cool. I'm with you on that one. Don't get into anything that sort of saps your energy. So if he's saying, kick your porn addiction, okay, I'm with you. And he said, like, this will increase your value as a guy. And there may be something to that. But my thing is, the gift of masculinity, and I think both masculinity and femininity are gifts from God, right? I think we're created beings made in God's image and likeness. And part of that is that our bodies are literally fit together, right? And that's what the marriage covenant does, is brings two together as one. So part of the reason I reject, that part of what the Manosphere is pushing is that men need women and women need men, right? We can't just live as these atomized lives where there's constant resentment. But my masculine strength and my earning potential should be used for a particular purpose that's greater, that's outside of myself. Because a man who thinks he's a king but has no queen and no heirs is just a rich guy in a big house. And once he's gone, that's the end of his line. So I don't think it's wise to advise men to live like they're 20 forever. So that's how I would respond to that. The other thing is this: getting married and particularly having children completely changed me as a person, and it got me up off the couch, sort of with some of these culture war things. Because before that, I could have commentary and I could say these are my opinions. But once you have kids, and particularly, obviously, a lot of the controversies around what kids are being taught in school. Now you have real skin in the game, like real skin in the game. It's not just philosophical anymore. The this is the difference between your 12-year-old girl sort of being told, no, you're not just a tomboy, you're a boy named Tom, because you like to play basketball and wear overalls. Things that we grew up seeing girls do. Like, there was a name for that. It was, you're a tomboy.
I did
And
both
nobody
those
questioned.
things,
Right. So and I think that when people like Admiral Levine, Richard Levine, who goes by Rachel now, says that official government policy should be, for gender confused kids, so to speak, should be social, medicinal, and surgical transition. I don't think that the people fighting him on the front line should be women. I think it should be dads who line up, surround the CDC, the NIH, local school board, the central office, individual schools, libraries, wherever. I think it should be men who take up their positions and are on their posts to say, you are not going to do this to me, that this is the way it's going to go. Some trouble on your hands, right? Now, again, let me just say this. Personal opinions. I'm not speaking on behalf of any organization, and I am not advocating violence or any type of violent conduct. But part of what I see in the way school administrators, elected officials, and unelected bureaucrats, the way that they're operating as it relates to kids and gender ideology, they are acting like people who have no fear of consequences, right? When I was a young guy growing up and I met a girl and she said she has 7 brothers, I carried myself in a different way because I knew if I messed with her, then I would be inviting the wrath of her 7 brothers. But if you're a guy and you're like, look, this girl don't even have a dad, let alone brothers, you operate in a different way. And what the people I'm talking about, they have no fear because they know in our society, going back to sort of the cultural reference, it's not lost on me that one of the biggest acts in hip hop today is a woman named Meg Thee Stallion. So she's literally named after a horse that's been uncut. And I would argue that in today's culture, the women are stallions and the men are geldings. And that's why so many women are on the front lines of all cultural battles, because the guys have been snipped. And they have grown up in a culture that for 60 years has told them their impulses. The few guys left will say, you know what? I don't think being half naked all the time is good for you or society. I don't think that shows that you have respect for yourself, your family, your fellow man, or your community. Those guys have been beaten into submission. And what you get are the feminist allies that say, yo, yes, queen, oh, slay girlfriend, and all that other stuff. So guys are weak. And I don't think selling guys additional weakness in the form of well, you shouldn't get married and have a family because there's a chance that it may fail is a good deal for men. Now, mind you, these same men would not tell other guys not to start a business for fear that a business may fail, and many of them do, but they'll tell them don't get married and have kids because it may not work out for you. And there's just something about that I can't wrap my mind around, because marriage and family, and I'll just speak for myself, are not only my highest vocations, but they also gave me something both to live and die for. And when my wife had, her last birthday, and we were talking, the kids were in bed, and I said, look, I hope you know that I would literally lay my life on the line for you. That's not talk. If a bullet was speeding towards you, I would step in front of it and take it for you. And you don't get that with conscious co-parenting. You don't get that with baby mama drama. You don't get that with a surrogate sperm donor relationship. That type of commitment only comes through marriage. And that's why I think we can't allow, and I don't want to say lesser, but lesser relationship forms to, I don't think we should look at those. I don't think the type of conscious co-parenting that sort of people like Van Jones and other people advocate are a good substitute for marriage, because I've never seen, for better or for worse, till death do us part in any child support decree that I've ever heard of. So I think there's a reason to keep what we've had and what sustained us for so long. I don't think we should abandon that just because we're going through a difficult season right now.
On that note, Delano Squires, thank you so much for joining High Noon. Where can people find more of your work?
Well, I do most of my attempts to stay out of trouble are on Twitter. Again, not very successful, but they can follow me at Delano Squires, DelanosQuires, all one string, on Twitter and on Instagram.
Thanks very much. And thanks to our listeners. High Noon with Inez Stepman is the production of the Independent Women's Forum. As always, you can send comments and questions to inez.stepman@iwf.org. Please help us out by hitting the subscribe button and leaving us a comment or review on Apple Podcasts, Acast, Google Play, YouTube, or iwf.org. Be brave, and we'll see you next time on High Noon.